Engines don't lie. People do. That was the first lesson I ever learned in my old man's garage. And it stuck with me through 58 years of grease, busted knuckles, and long days spent under the hood. My name is Leo Harrison. I've spent my life fixing what's broken, except for the one thing I should have seen coming. The garage was quiet that evening. The kind of quiet that settles when the day's work is done, but the smell of oil and hot metal still lingers in the air. I was wiping down a set of wrenches when I noticed Frances's car pulling into the lot. Too early to be coming home from her charity meetings. Too late to have just stepped out for errands. I watched through the smudged office window as she sat there a second longer than necessary, fingers tight on the steering wheel. Then, just like that, the moment passed. She grabbed her purse, fixed her hair in the mirror, and walked inside like nothing was out of place. "Long day?" she asked, hanging her coat by the door like she had 100 times before. I nodded, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "Same as always. You?" "Meetings ran late," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "Bored stuff, nothing exciting." Something about the way she said it stuck with me. Too rehearsed, too smooth. I'd spent years listening to engines rattle, learning their tells, understanding when something was running a little off. People weren't much different. I let it sit, didn't press. Pressing makes people careful, and careful people stop making mistakes. That night, she showered longer than usual. A half hour under scalding water like she was washing something off. I sat at the table, half listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the slow creak of the pipes in the walls. I should have asked her right then. But confrontation only works when you know exactly what you're walking into. A few days later, I got my first real answer. It was a Tuesday mid-afternoon, when I stopped by Nash's diner for coffee. Same place I'd been going to for years. I was leaning against the counter, waiting for my order, when I saw her, Frances, sitting in the back booth, tucked away like she didn't want to be seen. And across from her, Lincoln Reynolds. Lincoln was the kind of guy who never had to get his hands dirty. Real estate money, always dressed like he was heading to a country club. The type who'd rather pay a man to fix something than figure it out himself. We'd known each other for years, ran in the same circles, but we were never friends. A man like that had nothing to say to a man like me. But there he was, leaning in close, talking to my wife in a way a married woman shouldn't be talked to. And she was laughing, her hand resting on his wrist, eyes soft like they used to be when we were first married. I didn't make a scene, didn't say a damn thing, just watched. Watched how she smiled at him, how he leaned in, how they both thought no one was looking. And when I'd seen enough, I left. That night, she came home smelling like expensive cologne that sure as hell wasn't mine. "Good day?" she asked, placing her purse on the counter like nothing was different. "Same as always," I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping my face unreadable. "You?" She hesitated just for a second. "Meetings ran late." I nodded, took a sip of my beer. "Yeah, bet they did." The lie sat between us, heavy as a rusted wrench. She didn't push, and neither did I. Not yet. I'd learned long ago that fixing something meant knowing exactly where the damage was. And I was just getting started. I let it sit. A man doesn't rip apart an engine without knowing where the problem is. You listen, you watch, you wait for the moment when the whole damn thing slips and shows you exactly where it's cracked. For the next few weeks, I paid attention. Frances's habits had changed. She took longer getting ready in the morning, started wearing perfume again, the kind she used back when we still cared about things like date nights. Her phone never left her side. I'd come in from the shop, and she'd be standing by the kitchen window, murmuring into it, voice low like she didn't want the walls to hear. One night, I walked in just as she ended a call. She locked the screen before I could see anything. "Who was that?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Harper," she answered too fast. "Talking about the charity gala." I nodded slow, watching her. "Yeah? What's she wearing?" Her face barely flickered, but it was enough. She hadn't thought that far ahead. "She's still deciding." "Mm-hmm." I grabbed a beer from the fridge and didn't say anything else. Let her sit in it. She changed the subject a minute later, asking about the shop, my guys, anything to shift my focus. The thing was, I already knew. A man who works with his hands learns to trust them. And that morning, those same hands had pulled a tiny GPS tracker from under her car's bumper. Not something you pick up at a department store either. Professional grade. That night, I went to my office and opened my laptop. Dug into some old connections from my army days, a buddy of mine who still worked in private security. A few texts, a wired payment, and I had access to her car's location for the past month. Lincoln's house. Lincoln's office. Some little motel outside of town. A pattern clear as a grease stain on a fresh rag. I stared at the screen, the hard proof right in front of me, and felt nothing. No anger, no grief. Just the quiet confirmation of something I'd already known. The next day, I walked into my lawyer's office. Mason Johnson had been handling my shop's contracts for years, a straight-shooting man who didn't waste time. He glanced up as I came in, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other. "Didn't expect to see you today, Leo," he said. "Something on your mind?" "Need to move some assets around," I said, taking a seat. Quietly. He set the pad down, folded his hands. "You in trouble?" I shook my head. "Not me." Mason studied me for a second, then nodded. "All right. What are we working with?" Over the next hour, I laid it out. The shop, the savings, the rental property I owned on the other side of town. Every dollar tied to my name, I wanted moved somewhere Francis couldn't touch. Mason didn't ask many questions. He just listened, writing things down in that slow, methodical way of his. By the time I left his office, the papers were in motion. The shop was being transferred into a new LLC. My accounts were shifting into places Francis wouldn't even know existed. Legally, she still had my last name. But financially? She wasn't my wife anymore. The next step was Lincoln. A man like him didn't care about love. He cared about power, appearances, reputation. I figured it was time to take a wrench to that. I didn't bother sneaking around. Just walked into his office the next afternoon like I belonged there. His secretary, some young thing in a tight blazer, barely glanced up. "Mr. Reynolds is in a meeting." "Yeah, I bet he is," I said, stepping past her. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to his office without knocking. Lincoln was sitting behind his oversized desk, looking every bit the polished businessman. His face went pale when he saw me. "Leo, eh?" I shut the door behind me. "Save it. We both know why I'm here." He cleared his throat, straightened his tie. "If this is about Francis, It is," I said, cutting him off. I stepped closer, leaning on his desk like I was about to explain how a carburetor worked. "You and I both know she ain't in love with you. She just needed something to keep herself entertained while I was working 14-hour days. But here's the thing, Lincoln, you're about to lose a hell of a lot more than I am." He swallowed hard, but he didn't deny it. Cowards never do. I pulled a manila envelope from my jacket and dropped it onto his desk. "That's a full report. Pictures, timestamps, even a couple of text logs. You can imagine what'll happen if that makes its way to your investors, your wife, your country club buddies." His jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "Simple. You disappear. You cut her loose, you stop calling, you stop seeing her. And if you try to make a problem out of this, I promise I'll make sure every damn person you do business with knows exactly what kind of man you are." Lincoln was sweating now, running numbers in his head. A man like him had a lot to lose, his money, his reputation, his social standing. More than I ever did. "All right," he said finally, voice tight. "I'll end it." I nodded once and turned to leave. Paused at the door. "Oh, and Lincoln?" He looked up, face tense. "You ever come near my wife again, and I won't be settling this in an office." I didn't wait for his response. Just walked out, left him sitting there, drowning in his own damn mess. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I finally felt like I had my hands back on the wheel. I went back to work like nothing happened. Routine is a powerful thing. Keeps a man steady, makes people think everything's normal. And that's exactly what I needed for Francis to think I was the same Leo Harrison, predictable, steady, too busy fixing transmissions to notice my marriage was shot to hell. She still kept up the act. Still left in the morning with some excuse, still came home with a fresh layer of guilt under her perfume. Only difference was Lincoln had stopped taking her calls. I saw it in the way she checked her phone constantly, frustration tightening her shoulders when nothing came through. She was unraveling, and I wasn't about to stop it. One evening, she walked into the garage, arms crossed, trying to look casual. "You've been quiet," she said. I didn't look up from under the hood of a '72 Chevelle. "Guess I've been busy." "You sure that's all?" I wiped my hands off on a rag, closed the hood with a solid thunk. "Something you want to ask me, Francis?" She hesitated. "You just seem distant." I met her eyes then, steady. "Distant, huh?" I let the words sit in the air between us. "Nah, I'm right here. Always been right here." Something flickered in her face, guilt, maybe, or fear. She gave a tight smile. I'll let you finish up. Dinner's in an hour. I watched her walk away, already knowing she'd spend half that hour staring at her phone, waiting on a man who wasn't gonna call. And I let her. The real work had already started. While she was too busy wondering why Lincoln disappeared, I was tying up every loose end that might let her crawl out of this clean. Mason had moved fast. The shop was now under the LLC, every dollar of my savings accounted for in places she had no access to. The house, too. That was the part that stung, knowing I'd built that place with my own hands, laid every damn tile, but she'd be the one packing her bags. But she wouldn't be taking anything that mattered with her. One afternoon, Genevieve stopped by the shop, bringing paperwork Mason had sent over. She lingered a little, shifting from one foot to the other, hesitant like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. I leaned against the counter, flipping through the documents. Spit it out, Genevieve. She glanced at the office door, lowered her voice. You're really going through with this? I gave her a look. You think I'd go this far if I wasn't? She nodded, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. I've worked with you a long time. You don't talk about your personal life much, but I know this has to be. She stopped herself. Never mind. I closed the folder, set it aside. Genevieve, I appreciate you. But don't go wasting sympathy on people who don't deserve it. She met my eyes, something understanding in the way she nodded. You need anything else? Just make sure those papers are filed right. Already on it. She turned to go, hesitated. For what it's worth, Leo, you're handling this better than most would. I didn't say anything. Just watched her walk out, then went back to work. By the time the weekend rolled around, Frances was on edge. I could see it in the way she hovered around me, testing the waters, trying to figure out if I knew something. But I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a fight. That's what she wanted, some big emotional blowout so she could cry and twist things around, make herself feel like the victim. I gave her nothing. And it was driving her crazy. Sunday morning, I sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the paper when she finally cracked. You've been acting strange, she said, arms crossed tight. I turned the page. That's so? Yes, that's so. You don't talk, you barely look at me. If I didn't know any better, I think something was wrong. I took my time setting the paper down. Looked at her like she was a car with a blown head gasket, beyond fixing. You really want to have this conversation, Frances? Something shifted in her expression. Like she wasn't sure if she did. I just think, she said carefully, if something's wrong, we should talk about it. I let out a slow breath. All right, let's talk about it. I stood up, grabbed my keys off the counter. Get in the truck. She blinked. What? You want to talk? We're going for a drive. Confused but too off balance to argue, she followed me out. We drove in silence, the weight of it pressing against her. I didn't say a word until we pulled up in front of Nash's diner. She stared at the place, then at me. Why are we here? I killed the engine, leaned back in my seat. Thought maybe you'd want to sit in your favorite booth. You know, the one in the back, where you like to have lunch dates with Lincoln Reynolds. Her face went white. I didn't move, didn't blink. Just let it sink in. She swallowed hard, her voice barely steady. I don't know what you're talking about. I huffed out a laugh. That right? I reached over, pulled an envelope from the glove box and tossed it in her lap. Then you won't mind taking a look at that. She stared at it, hands shaking slightly as she opened it. Photos. Timestamps. Proof. When she finally looked up at me, there was no point in pretending anymore. How long have you known? She asked, voice small. Long enough. I looked her over, the carefully done hair, the polished nails, the clothes I paid for while she ran around town with another man. She took a shaky breath. Leo, don't. I cut her off. I don't need the excuses. I don't need the tears. You did this, Frances. You made this choice. She looked away, swallowing hard, like she was trying to find some way to talk her way out of it. But there wasn't one. Not this time. I reached for the door handle. Get out. Her head snapped toward me. What? You heard me. I jerked my chin toward the diner. Go on. Get yourself a coffee. Hell, maybe Lincoln will show up. She didn't move. Just sat there, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man sitting next to her. I sighed, shaking my head. I'll have the divorce papers to you in a few days. Pack your things. You've got a week. Her lip trembled. Where am I supposed to go? I shrugged. Not my problem. I got out of the truck, slamming the door behind me. Didn't look back as I walked into the diner, sat at the counter, and ordered my usual black coffee. Through the window, I saw her still sitting in the truck, hands clenched in her lap. Eventually, she climbed out, heels clicking on the pavement, and walked off in the opposite direction. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted better than it had in months. I spent the next few days tying up loose ends. Frances had gone quiet, probably in damage control mode, scrambling to figure out her next move. But it didn't matter, there weren't many moves left for her to make. Lincoln had already cut her off, my money was locked down, and I had all the leverage I needed. At the shop, things ran like normal. Engines still needed fixing, customers still rolled in with busted transmissions, and I still did what I'd always done, worked with my hands, focused on the job, kept moving forward. But people talk in a town like Blue Ridge. Word had gotten around that something was off in the Harrison house, and I could feel the quiet stares when I walked into the diner, the way conversation slowed when I passed by. Genevieve came by the shop late one evening, carrying a thick envelope from Mason. She waited until the guys had clocked out before stepping into my office, setting it down on the desk. Finalized, she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. Once she signs, it's done. I nodded, flipping through the pages. Everything was as it should be. Frances wasn't walking away with a damn thing except the clothes she packed. Appreciate it, I said, setting the papers aside. She hesitated. You good? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. Been better. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. She lingered another moment before saying, let me know if you need anything. I gave her a look. You ever know me to ask for help? A small smile flickered across her face. No. But if you ever do, you know where to find me. She left after that, quiet and steady, like always. That night, Frances finally called. I let it ring a few times before answering. Her voice was tense. We need to talk. I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the darkened street. We already did. I need more time, Leo. I let out a dry laugh. Time for what? You already made your choices. She exhaled sharply. You're really just throwing me out like this? After everything? After everything? I repeated. Frances, you walked out on this marriage the second you started sneaking around with Lincoln Reynolds. I'm just making it official. You don't understand, she said, voice strained. No, I understand just fine. You thought you could have it both ways. A husband who worked himself to the bone for you and a side piece who told you what you wanted to hear. And now, when it's all crashing down, you want sympathy. There was a long silence. Then, quieter, I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head, more tired than anything. Yeah? Well, you did. She sniffed, but I didn't hear any real crying. Just the kind of silence that came when someone realized they'd lost. What am I supposed to do now? She finally asked. Figure it out, I said. Like the rest of us do. I hung up before she could say another word. The next morning, I handed Mason the signed paperwork. Make it quick, I said, sliding the envelope across his desk. He gave me a sharp nod. You sure you don't want to push for more? She put you through hell, Leo? I could make sure she feels it. I thought about it, then shook my head. She already does. The week passed slow. Frances packed up and left without much fuss, her car stuffed with suitcases, her face pale and tight. I didn't watch her go. Just stayed in the garage, fixing an old Ford, keeping my hands busy while my life reset itself. By the time the town's annual community fundraiser rolled around, the divorce was finalized, my accounts were settled, and Frances was nothing more than a name on old paperwork. I wasn't much for events, but Nash, the diner's owner, had personally asked me to show up. Said they were doing something special this year. So I went. Walked into the town hall to find half of Blue Ridge gathered, chatting over cheap wine and finger foods. People gave me nods, claps on the back, a few knowing looks that said they'd heard the whole story. I didn't entertain them. Just grabbed a drink and found a quiet spot to stand. Then they called my name. Nash grinned from the podium. Now, before we wrap up tonight, we got a man here who's been fixing this town's engines for longer than some of you have been driving. Leo Harrison, come on up here. A round of applause broke out. I hesitated, but when a man like Nash tells you to do something, you do it. So I walked up, stood beside him as he pulled a plaque from behind the podium. For years, Leo's been keeping this town running, Nash said. Not just with cars, but with hard work, integrity, and a whole lot of patience. This town wouldn't be the same without him. He handed me the plaque, clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. We appreciate you, Leo. The applause started up again. I held the plaque, nodding once, feeling something settle deep in my chest. Not pride exactly, just knowing that no matter what Frances took from me, she couldn't take this. My work, my people, my damn good name. I caught a glance of Genevieve in the crowd, arms crossed, giving me a small nod. No pity, just respect. That was the kind of thing that mattered. As I stepped off the stage, I spotted Frances near the exit, half hidden in the shadows. She looked smaller than I remembered, like she didn't quite know where she fit in anymore. When our eyes met, she looked away, disappearing into the night. I exhaled, feeling something uncoil in my chest. I'd spent enough time looking back. Time to move forward. I took another sip of my drink and let the past slip away. The shop was quieter now, not because business had slowed down. If anything, it was busier than ever, but because my head was finally clear. No more coming home wondering what lie I'd be fed that night. No more watching my wife slip into the bathroom to check her phone. No more waiting for a fight that was never worth having. The weight had lifted, and I wasn't looking to pick it back up. It took Francis exactly 3 weeks to call me again. I was under the hood of a '68 Charger when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped my hands on a rag before pulling it out, saw her name on the screen, and almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. "Leo," she said, hesitating just a second too long. I hope you're doing all right." I set the rag down, leaning against the workbench. "Yeah. What do you need?" She exhaled, like she'd been hoping for a different response. I wanted to talk." I glanced at the half-rebuilt engine in front of me. "Talk about what?" There was a pause. "I don't know. Everything, I guess." I let that hang in the air. Everything. Now, after she'd taken a wrecking ball to it, she wanted to sift through the pieces like there was something left worth saving. "You got something specific to say, Francis? 'Cause I got work to do." "I miss you," she said, voice quieter now, like she thought that might be enough. I let out a short breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "No, you don't. You miss what I gave you. Stability. A house. A name that meant something in this town. You don't miss me. You miss what I built, and now that you don't have it, you want to talk. That's not fair." I rubbed a hand over my jaw. "No? Tell me what is, then." "You walked, Francis. I didn't lock the door behind you. You had everything a woman could ask for. A husband who worked his ass off to give you a good life. And it wasn't enough." Her breath hitched slightly. "I made a mistake, Leo." "You sure did." I didn't raise my voice, didn't let the anger creep in, just stated it like a fact. "But that's the thing about mistakes. You live with them." She was silent for a long moment. "I don't know what to do." I shook my head, more at myself than anything. "That's not my problem anymore." I hung up before she could try to pull anything else out of me. I didn't tell anyone about the call, but people in town had their own ways of keeping tabs. A week later, Nash slid a fresh cup of coffee in front of me at the diner, gave me a look. "Heard she called." I nodded, taking a sip. "She's been staying at the Whispering Pines Motel." His voice was neutral, just stating a fact. "Not looking too good." "Not my business." Nash leaned on the counter. "I know, but some people might feel a little guilty." I set my cup down, met his eyes. "Murph, I ain't losing sleep over this." He studied me for a second, then nodded, straightening up. "Good." And I meant it. I didn't feel bad for Francis. She wasn't starving. She wasn't dying in the street. She was just dealing with the consequences of her own damn choices. Work kept me steady. The shop was growing, more young guys coming in, looking for something solid, something real. I took on a couple of new apprentices, kids who reminded me of myself when I was young. Hands raw, eager to learn, looking for someone to set them straight. That kind of thing made sense to me. Machines didn't lie, and neither did hard work. One evening, Genevieve came by to drop off some paperwork from Mason. She lingered like she had something on her mind. "You want to grab a drink?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. I raised a brow. "You asking me out, Genevieve?" She smirked, shaking her head. "Not everything's a damn date, Leo. Just a drink." I chuckled, grabbed my jacket. "All right, let's go." We went to Nash's, same as always. Sat in the back, shared a bottle of whiskey, and talked about everything but Francis. It felt good. Clean. Like turning a wrench and feeling something click into place. The whiskey was smooth, the conversation easy. Genevieve wasn't the kind of woman who talked just to fill space. She listened, made sharp observations, and didn't try to pry into things that weren't her business. That was rare, and I respected it. After a while, she leaned back, rolling her glass between her fingers. "You know," she said, I've worked for you for almost 10 years and this is the first time we've sat down for a drink. I smirked, taking a sip. Yeah? Guess I've been busy. She gave me a look. Too busy for a drink? Too busy for much of anything outside that garage. I tapped the rim of my glass. Not sure I regret it. She tilted her head slightly, considering. Francis ever call again? Nope. Last thing she said was she didn't know what to do. Told her that wasn't my problem. Genevieve exhaled through her nose, amused. Cold. Honest. She nodded, lifting her glass. Fair enough. The night stretched on, and after a couple more drinks, we left Nash's, stepping out into the cool night air. Genevieve shoved her hands in her jacket pockets, glancing at me. So what now? I looked up at the sky, let out a slow breath. Same as always. Work. Keep things running. She nodded. Not a bad plan. I walked her to her car, not because she needed it, but because that's just what you do. She opened the door, paused, then gave me a small, knowing smile. Try to take a day off once in a while, Harrison. I huffed. Yeah, I'll get right on that. She got in, started the engine, and drove off, leaving me standing there in the quiet. A couple days later, Mason called. Figured you'd want to know Frances finalized her address change. Looks like she's moving out of town. I nodded to myself, barely feeling anything. That's so? Yeah. Signed all the paperwork. Guess she figured there's nothing left for her here. There isn't. Mason was quiet for a second. You good? Better than I've been in years. That was the truth. I hung up and got back to work. The guys were waiting on me to finish tuning an old Mustang, and I wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished. The Mustang's engine rumbled to life, smooth as silk, no hesitation, no rough edges. A good machine, built right, cared for. That's how things lasted, by putting in the work. I wiped my hands on a rag, stepping back as one of the young guys, Miles, grinned from the driver's seat. Damn, Leo, this thing purrs. I nodded, tightening a bolt one last time just for good measure. It should. You spent the last 3 weeks tearing it down and putting it back together. He shut off the ignition and climbed out, wiping his palms on his coveralls. Yeah, but you're the one who made it right. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. You'll get there. Just takes time. The kid grinned, and I saw a younger version of myself in him, hungry to learn, proud of what his hands could do. That was worth something. More than money, more than reputation. By the time I closed up for the night, the air had cooled, that sharp bite of early autumn settling in. I stepped outside, rolling my shoulders, taking in the quiet. Across the lot, Genevieve leaned against her car, arms crossed, like she'd been waiting. She lifted a brow. You take days off yet? I let out a short laugh. You see me closed, don't you? She smirked, pushing off the car. Baby steps, I guess. I shook my head. Something you need? She shrugged. Nah. Just thought you might want a drink. For a second, I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to, but because old habits die hard. I'd spent years putting my head down, working, keeping things running, being reliable. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to check with anyone, didn't have to wonder if I was making the right move. I pulled my keys from my pocket. Nash's or someplace new? Her smile was small, knowing. Surprise me. As we drove through town, past the places I'd spent my whole damn life, I realized something. I wasn't looking in the rearview anymore. And that felt just fine.